The factions arrived in Ironhaven within 2 days of the alignment, and they did not come with open hands. The chief's audience hall smelled of shea butter and sweat, and the iron tang of old blood that no amount of scrubbing had fully removed from the stone floor. 100 ceremonial smocks hung on the curved walls, woven across 10 centuries of political negotiation, their enchanted threads humming faintly in the proximity of so many practitioners gathered in one room. The amber light of oil lamps caught the dust motes stirred by the entry of 23 faction representatives, who had crossed territories in haste and arrived exhausted, unwashed, and furious. The Tindana Circle sent 3 elders carrying petrified staffs of office, institutional authority older than the building they stood in. They had come to punish Samini for breaking his oath. Unauthorized contact with the forbidden grove of Sunyani. Unauthorized use of the route road. Exposure of an apprentice to communion depths the circle had expressly prohibited. Every charge was documented in route line frequency, sealed in a communion vessel of petrified heartwood. The Damba Collective sent 4 temporal awareness specialists from the festival grounds of Yendi, their monitoring instruments still calibrated to the alignment frequencies that had broken every 7-year observational model they possessed. They wanted explanations. Their instruments had recorded a system-level event that their theoretical framework could not accommodate. The Ashvale Order sent 3 shadow warfare commanders, officers who had inherited leadership when Tohaje vanished 3 months ago and were grappling with reports from shadow binders across the territories that their bindings felt different, more purposeful, more connected, less like weapons and more like something they had no vocabulary for. And the Fugu Weavers Guild Master came personally, having already descended to the first loom, having already touched the tapestry. Adisa came not to challenge the truth, but to negotiate its implications with the tenacity of a woman protecting her institution's survival. Pogna Zara convened them. Not as the earth-bonded exercising authority, she had relinquished that pretense the moment she unsealed the protocol. She convened them as the woman who owed them the truth. Azindo stood at her side. The faction representatives stared at him, and 3 of them flinched. His hair had gone silver at the temples, not the gradual silver of age, but the brittle, mineral silver of someone whose body had conducted frequencies no human body was designed to carry. His cheekbones pressed against skin that looked stretched too thin, as if the alignment had burned away everything that was not essential. His shadow pooled at his feet in a shape that was not quite the shape a shadow should be, too dark, too still, too attentive. The Ashvale officers stared longest. They had trained for decades to read shadow states, and the shadow at Azindo's feet was broadcasting a diagnostic signal so dense that Commander Fashini's own binding vibrated in sympathetic response. His combat-trained shadow instinctively orienting toward the stronger field like a compass needle finding north. Fashini's hands clenched under the table. His shadow was not obeying him, it was obeying the room. Zara said, "Good morning." The formal Dagbani greeting, spoken to an audience about to hear a truth that would demolish every institution they served.
I have lied to all of you for 43 years. I am going to stop now.
She told them about the Zagele, not as mythology, as engineering. She told them about the theft. The moment, 1,000 years ago, when the surface peoples decided that the fragments given to them for custodianship were theirs to own, when the Tindana claimed the route lines, when the Enskinment was claimed by the chiefs, when the Fugu Weavers claimed the encoding, when the Ashvale Order claimed the shadow binding, when each faction built walls around its peace and developed origin stories that depended on the claim that their power was self-generated. She told them about Tohaje, about the third skin, the cage, the duet, the convergence, about 7 dead candidates whose deaths she could have prevented if she had spoken 43 years ago instead of sealing the truth behind an oath of terrified silence. The silence in the hall was the kind that has weight. 23 people breathing in a room that suddenly felt smaller. The room split. Elder Atinga, the most senior Tindana, pressed her palms flat on the stone floor. The root lines beneath the audience hall were singing, clean, clarified, carrying a signal strength she had never experienced in 50 years of communion. Tears ran into the deep lines of her face. Not grief. Recognition. The wrenching emotion of discovering that her life's work had been touching something sacred without knowing it, that every hour spent in communion had been a conversation with a partner she never realized was there. Her fingers spread against the stone, trembling, and Azindo watched the old woman's mouth open and close twice before sound came out. "It is true," she said. "The earth is saying it is true." The Damba delegates wept openly. Their tradition of temporal awareness, reading cosmic frequencies, celebrating the alignment's convergence with the reverence of timekeepers, was the closest thing to the Zagale's own consciousness that any faction had preserved. They had been keeping time for a heartbeat they did not know was alive. The youngest delegate, a woman barely older than Azindo, pressed her forehead against the table and her shoulders shook without sound. Her monitoring instruments, still clipped to her belt, registered frequencies they had no charts for. The guild master sat in calculated silence. Adisa had already processed the truth, had felt it in the first loom's tapestry, had run her fingers over Zagale's script and understood what it meant for the guild's survival. She was watching the other factions react, calculating. Her stillness was not shock. It was strategy. The woman had already moved past grief and into planning, which was either admirable or terrifying depending on which side of her planning you stood on. Commander Fushani stood up. His chair scraped stone. The sound cut through the murmuring like a blade. "You are telling us," he said, his voice thick with the controlled fury of a soldier whose entire institutional identity had just been called a comfortable fiction, "that the Ashvale Order, that we have been training children to weaponize medical instruments, that we have spent centuries building an army out of stethoscopes."
"Oh, yes,"
Zara said. "And the man who exploited this, who murdered 7 candidates, who built a cage from the system you sealed. You expect us to simply accept that this man now sits in your custody rather than in chains." Tohage was in the room, northeast corner where the shadows pooled deepest. He had not spoken. His shadow was flat and still, the binding stripped of its offensive capacity by the convergence, reduced to its original diagnostic function. The cage maker, disarmed, sitting in a room full of people who wanted him dead, alive only because the system needed his knowledge more than the factions needed his blood. His hands rested on his thighs, motionless, and the lamplight that reached his corner was thin enough that his features were suggestion rather than detail.
Tohage answers to the custodian network,
Kofi said, rising from his seat against the western wall. The scavenger from the depths, still wearing clothes that were barely better than rags, his bad knee visible in the hitch of his stance. No credentials, no institutional backing, only the knowledge that burned in his reformed mind.
"He is not being pardoned. He is being repurposed."
Repurposed. Fushani's voice was flat with contempt. A shadow commander does not get repurposed like a broken tool.
"That is precisely what shadow commanders are.
Kofi said.
Tools, diagnostic tools, maintained by a system you did not build and do not own. The system is offering you a choice. Continue believing you are warriors wielding weapons, or accept that you are custodians maintaining instruments. The instruments work either way. Your understanding of them does not change their function."
Kofi paused. The hall watched a man in rags lecture a military commander, and the rags meant nothing because the words landed with the weight of someone who had nearly died for the right to speak them. His knee buckled slightly and he gripped the table's edge. His knuckles went white. He did not sit.
"We were not custodians,"
he said.
"We were thieves. Every faction in this room. We stole fragments of a living system and built fortresses around the pieces. And when the system began to die from our theft, we blamed each other for the symptoms instead of returning what was never ours."
The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Kofi sat down, the weight off his knee, his face gray with the effort of standing. Fushani's shadow surged. Not a deliberate combat extension, an involuntary response, the binding reacting to its bearer's rage with the same automatic sensitivity that a flinch expresses pain. The shadow stretched toward Kofi across 3 meters of stone floor, dark and sharp, and carrying the geometric distortion of a binding pushed toward offensive configuration. Azindo's shadow intercepted it, not aggressively, diagnostically. The custodian's shadow met the commander's extension with the gentle, implacable authority of a system-level diagnostic reading, a subsystem's output. Fushani's shadow was assessed, catalogued, and returned to neutral in the space of a heartbeat. The commander felt it, felt his binding being handled the way a physician handles a limb during examination, with professional competence and zero regard for the limb's opinion of the process. Fushani sat down, not because he was defeated, because his shadow had just demonstrated, in front of his officers, that the diagnostic function was stronger than the combat function, that the system's design was more powerful than the order's modification. The chair received him with a creak that sounded, in the hall's silence, like punctuation. The second officer, Commander Al-Hassan, spoke into the silence. The order will require time to. The order does not have time. This was the Kambonaba, a Bukhari, Ironhaven's military commander, who had been standing against the western wall with an officer's posture and a civilian's patience. 7 candidates are dead. The system nearly collapsed. Every faction in this room contributed to the conditions that produced both outcomes. Time is what we have been wasting for 1,000 years. Elder Attinga lifted her palms from the floor. Her tears had stopped, but her face was still wet, glistening in the lamplight. She smelled of the road, 2 days of travel, dust ground into her wrapper, the sweat of a 73-year-old body that had crossed territories on foot because the matter was too urgent for delegation. The root lines confirm what Zara has said. Every word. I can feel them, clean, clear, singing at a strength I have never experienced. The evidence is not in her testimony. It is in the communion. Any Tindana can verify it by pressing hands to earth. We are not Tindana. Fushani said. No, you are shadow binders. And your shadow is telling you the same thing my communion is telling me, if you would stop shouting long enough to listen to it. The room went silent. The oil lamps flickered. Someone's stomach growled, the undeniable sound of a human body reminding a room full of magical practitioners that they had been arguing for 6 hours without eating. The sound broke something that needed breaking. A Damba delegate covered her mouth with her hand. Fushani's jaw tightened against what might have been a smile. Guildmaster Adisa stood. I propose we eat. As she said, the truth will still be here after rice. The laugh that broke the tension was not loud, but it was genuine. Rice. The most practical word spoken in 6 hours of institutional demolition. The attendants brought calabashes of chuo zafi and groundnut soup, the heavy, filling staple of the north, served communally from shared bowls, eaten with the right hand, the physical ritual of people who might disagree on everything except the fact that they were hungry. The groundnut soup was thick with dawadawa and smoked fish, the fermented locust bean adding a pungent depth that sat at the back of the tongue and lingered. The chuo zafi was smooth, freshly turned, steaming in the calabash with the particular glossy surface that meant the cook had used patience and the right ratio of water to millet flour. They ate. The Ashvale officers ate beside the Tindana elders. The Damba delegates ate beside the guild master. Kofi ate beside Fushani, and neither spoke, but the silence between them was the silence of men eating rather than the silence of men at war, and that distinction mattered. Hands moved from calabash to mouth in the shared rhythm of a communal meal, and the rhythm softened what words had hardened. The conversation resumed after the meal. It lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 2nd day, Commander Fushani asked Azindo to demonstrate the diagnostic function on his binding, privately, in the corridor outside the hall, where institutional pride could bend without public witness. The demonstration lasted 10 minutes. Fushani emerged with red eyes and a jaw set in the configuration of a man who had felt something he could not deny and was reorganizing his worldview around the feeling. He smelled of something metallic. The ozone scent of a shadow binding, pushed to its designed capacity for the first time in its bearer's life. He did not speak for the rest of the day, but his silence was different from the silence of the first morning. It was the silence of a man listening. On the afternoon of the second day, the Damba Collective presented their temporal records, 7 cycles of alignment data, painstakingly maintained, now recontextualized. The records showed what the collective had always believed were astronomical observations. In light of the Zagale's existence, the records were medical charts. The alignment's 7-year cycle was the system's heartbeat. The collective had been taking the pulse of a living thing and recording it as weather. The youngest delegate wept again. This time, others wept with her. On the third afternoon, they voted. Not on a treaty. Treaties implied parties with competing interests reaching compromise. This was a vote to accept a shared inheritance, to acknowledge that custodianship was not a political arrangement but a biological fact, that the system existed whether they acknowledged it or not, and that maintaining it required the cooperation of all fragments, not the dominance of any. Fashani voted in favor. His 2 officers voted against. The order was split. The Tindana voted unanimously in favor. Atinga's communion had settled the matter for her delegation before the second day began. The Damba Collective voted in favor with tears. The Guild Master voted in favor with conditions, pages of conditions, delivered in Addis's neat script, each one a negotiating position for a woman who intended the guild to survive the truth intact. It was not a treaty. It was the agreement to keep talking. A seed planted in stone, watered with groundnut soup and institutional rage, and the stubborn refusal of 23 people to walk away from a table where truth was being served alongside the rice. Seeds grow, whether the gardeners intend them to or not. Outside the hall, the Harmattan wind carried dust across the rooftops. Azindo stood in the corridor as the delegates filed out, some with purpose, some with the dazed gait of people carrying a new weight. His shadow read each one as they passed. Diagnostic, automatic, the custodian's constant assessment. 23 frequencies, each shifted from where they had been 3 days ago. Not healed, not resolved, changed. The way a bone changes after it breaks and mends, stronger at the fracture. Different in shape, carrying the history of the break in its new architecture. Zara found him there. She leaned against the opposite wall, arms folded, the ceremonial authority stripped away, and beneath it, a woman who looked her 70 years.
It is done.
She said,
The beginning of done's.
The Ashvale officers who voted against will take the dissent back to their order.
Yes, and the order will send more officers, and we will have the conversation again, and again. As many times as the stone requires before the seed takes root.
She unfolded her arms. Her hands were steady.
That is what custodians do. They maintain. Even when the thing they maintain is a conversation no one wants to have.
Azindo's shadow settled at his feet. The hall behind them emptied. The oil lamps guttered in the draft from the open doors, throwing long shadows that his binding read and catalogued and filed under the Tuesday report that would document the first week of the custodian network's existence. The first week, the first conversation, the first seed. The rest would take seasons,